In the shadowed corridors of Lubyanka, deep within the nerve center of Soviet intelligence, a single belief began to metastasize through the veins of the KGB, an unwavering conviction that the United States was preparing for a surprise nuclear-first strike, a belief so deeply held, so institutionalized, that it would become the most dangerous intelligence operation of the entire Cold War. Operation Ryan, short for Raketno-Yadernoye Napadany, the nuclear missile attack, a code name that encapsulated the paranoid heartbeat of a superpower convinced that Armageddon was not just possible, but imminent, as if written into the very logic of American strategy. The year was 1981, and Yuri Andropov, then the iron-willed chairman of the KGB, stood before his senior officers delivering a chilling directive. The West, specifically the Reagan administration, was preparing to strike the Soviet Union without warning, using speed, deception, and overwhelming nuclear force to decapitate Soviet leadership before Moscow could respond. Andropov's voice, dry and cold as winter wind, carried the weight of an empire's insecurity. His belief was unwavering. The Americans were preparing to finish the Cold War in a single flash of white fire. What made this moment uniquely dangerous was not that Washington was preparing anything. It wasn't. But that Moscow had convinced itself it was, and in intelligence work, perception becomes reality. Operation Ryan was born of this fear, an unprecedented global intelligence collection program that ordered every KGB station in every country to report on the smallest signs, no matter how mundane, that might indicate the West was preparing for nuclear war. It was the largest peacetime intelligence mobilization in Soviet history, and its goal was not simply to understand the United States, but to anticipate the exact hour of doomsday. From London to Berlin, from Washington to Tokyo, KGB residenturas were instructed to monitor hospitals for unusual blood shipments, government buildings for unusual nighttime lights, military bases for sudden movement, ministers for strange silences, and even suburban neighborhoods for indicators of mass evacuation behavior, such as people buying canned foods or filling their cars at night. Nothing was too small. Nothing was irrelevant. Ryan was the institutionalization of paranoia, a program built on the idea that nuclear war was inevitable, and that the only question was who struck first. And because the Soviets assumed the Americans would strike first, it meant the KGB was always searching for proof that reality matched their expectations. It was a psychological trap, and once Moscow fell into it, there was no way out. The tone from the top was absolute. Report everything. Interpret everything as hostile. Assume nothing is innocent. Soviet intelligence officers suddenly found themselves in a world where ordinary diplomatic ceremonies became possible, cover for a pre-war mobilization, where NATO exercises looked like rehearsal for Armageddon, where Ronald Reagan's fiery speeches, especially his now infamous line calling the USSR an evil empire, were not political theater, but coded signals to U.S. military planners. This was the world Operation Ryan created, a world where the Soviets believed they were living in the last calm moments before a nuclear storm. What made Operation Ryan uniquely lethal was not the intelligence it collected, but the mindset it enforced. KGB officers were not tasked with discovering whether the United States intended to strike. They were tasked with confirming it. It was a mission born of bias, and bias is the enemy of truth. One of the earliest KGB cables describing Ryan instructed officers to identify and document all indications of preparations for Ryan by the adversary, as if the United States had already made the decision to attack. This phrasing would shape the next decade of Soviet intelligence in ways that nearly turned fear into apocalypse. In 1982, KGB agents in London reported that British government ministers were unusually tense and arriving at work earlier than normal, possible signs, Moscow believed, of an impending nuclear decision. In truth, they were preparing for the Falklands War. In West Germany, KGB officers monitored funerals of NATO officials, convinced that increased attendance meant the alliance was quietly preparing for national emergency government continuity. In reality, it was simply a flu season with higher deaths among older officers. But the KGB didn't see reality. They saw Ryan indicators. Every field report, no matter how insignificant, flowed back to Moscow, where analysts, operating under pressure from above, interpreted them within a predetermined narrative. America was preparing for a surprise nuclear strike. The only question was when. The psychological pressure placed on KGB residentura's around the world became immense. Officers complained privately that they were being asked to report on meaningless observations. But the fear of failing Andropov, or missing the warning signs of Armageddon, kept them compliant. No one wanted to be the intelligence officer who ignored the clue that preceded a nuclear strike. Andropov himself believed passionately in the threat. His health declining, his worldview hardened by decades of adversarial conflict with the West, he interpreted Reagan's military buildup, particularly the deployment of Pershing II missiles in Europe, as proof that the United States now possessed a decapitation weapon capable of destroying Moscow within minutes. The idea that the U.S. would stage a surprise nuclear attack was not some fringe theory within the Kremlin. It became the dominant institutional belief guiding Soviet intelligence, and Operation Ryan was the mechanism that operationalized it. While the West interpreted the Soviet Union's fear as bluster, Moscow saw itself as a cornered animal preparing for survival. What made this dynamic extremely dangerous was the Soviets' belief that nuclear war could be survivable if detected early enough. The KGB believed that, with sufficient warning, the USSR could disperse leadership, prepare air defenses, mobilize submarine fleets, and launch retaliatory strikes before being fully destroyed. To Western analysts, this belief sounded insane. To Moscow, it was essential doctrine. In the early 1980s, as Ryan expanded, something even more dangerous happened. The KGB began feeding its own paranoia. Reports from foreign stations were written in a tone that reinforced Andropov's fears. Analysts in Moscow filtered information through a lens that magnified the threat. And Politburo members, old, isolated, mostly sick, interpreted that intelligence within the context of their own anxiety about Reagan's rhetoric and America's technological superiority. A feedback loop of fear formed at the highest levels of the Soviet government, each layer confirming the next. The military feared the worst because the KGB said so. The KGB feared the worst because Andropov believed it. And Andropov believed it because the military and intelligence agencies were reporting it. No one asked, "What if we're wrong?" In 1983, this spiral of fear would collide with NATO's Able Archer exercise, turning Operation Ryan from a dangerous intelligence program into something far more lethal, a hair trigger that could have launched nuclear war over a misunderstanding. But long before Able Archer, long before the world realized how close it came to annihilation, Operation Ryan was already reshaping Soviet decision-making, tightening the Kremlin's nerves, shortening its temper, and increasing the likelihood of catastrophic miscalculation. As this paranoia deepened, Soviet military commanders became more jumpy, more willing to interpret ambiguities as existential threats, more willing to preempt rather than react. Even routine NATO training flights triggered alerts. Submarine patrols became more aggressive. radar operators became more anxious. The margin for error shrank to almost nothing. By 1982, the Soviet Union had effectively locked itself inside a worldview where nuclear war could begin at any moment, where the slightest misinterpretation, the slightest technical glitch, the slightest diplomatic misunderstanding could ignite a conflict from which there would be no return. Inside the Kremlin, a storm was gathering, and Operation Ryan was the engine driving it forward. What made Operation Ryan more dangerous than anything the Soviet Union had ever undertaken was not only the paranoia baked into its design, but the timing. Because as the KGB expanded, Ryan in 1983, the geopolitical atmosphere between Washington and Moscow deteriorated into one of the most volatile and mistrustful periods since the Cuban Missile Crisis, with both sides misreading each other so profoundly that accidental nuclear war became a disturbingly realistic possibility. In the United States, President Ronald Reagan was escalating military pressure with an unprecedented strategic buildup, deploying the highly accurate Pershing II missiles to West Germany, missiles that could reach Moscow in less than 10 minutes, shorter than the time needed for the Kremlin to confirm that an attack was real, while simultaneously unveiling the Strategic Defense Initiative, a futuristic missile shield the Soviets interpreted not as defensive, but as preparation for a first strike. Because no nation builds a shield unless it intends to throw the first punch, or at least that was the Soviet interpretation. And this perception fed directly into Operation Ryan's machinery of fear. Reagan's rhetoric, too, mattered enormously. His now famous Evil Empire speech in March 1983 confirmed to the Kremlin that the American president saw the Cold War not as a political conflict, but as a moral crusade. And when an adversary believes he is fighting evil itself, Soviet leaders reasoned, what would stop him from choosing a preemptive nuclear strike to end the ideological struggle once and for all? All of this poured gasoline on the psychological fire Andropov had already lit inside Soviet intelligence. As Ryan deepened, the KGB demanded increasingly extreme reports from its residenturas abroad, and officers were forced to treat even trivial details as potential indicators of American mobilization. One KGB station chief in East Berlin wrote in frustration that he was being asked to report every flicker of light in a NATO building, while officers in London were asked to monitor retail behavior in grocery stores, the logic being that sudden increases in canned food purchases could signal the British government preparing its population for nuclear war. These absurdities weren't anomalies. They became doctrine. The KGB began tracking blood banks, hospital supply chains, unusual construction activity near military bases, higher than usual traffic after dark, and even the shadows cast by lights left on inside Western government offices late into the night. In one surreal instance, the KGB Residentura in Copenhagen reported that several senior Danish officials appeared unusually tired during public appearances, possibly, they theorized, because they were losing sleep over imminent war preparations. This report, like many others, was sent to Moscow and filed under probable indicators of nuclear readiness. It would be comical if it weren't so terrifying. By mid-1983, the KGB was drowning in Ryan data, and because the operation was built on the assumption that a first strike was imminent, analysts in Moscow interpreted the flood of ambiguous, meaningless observations as mounting evidence that the United States was accelerating its preparations. The Soviet military leadership began demanding readiness to respond within minutes. Strategic rocket forces were placed on higher alert. Submarine patrols were intensified. Defenses were tightened across the western USSR. Radar operators were ordered to treat even the smallest anomaly as a potential prelude to a missile launch. The entire Soviet early warning system, already antiquated and fragile compared to its American counterpart, was being pushed to its limits at the exact moment when the Kremlin's ability to distinguish truth from fear-based interpretation was collapsing. Andropov, by then gravely ill and increasingly isolated, received these Ryan reports with a mixture of dread and vindication. To him, they confirmed what he already believed, that Reagan was preparing to strike. This entrenched worldview meant that even when Ryan reports contradicted each other or lacked credibility, the Kremlin still treated them as evidence of looming catastrophe. In effect, the Soviet leadership was primed psychologically to misinterpret any NATO activity as hostile. That is the environment into which NATO's annual command post exercise, Able Archer 83, emerged, a simulation that, under ordinary circumstances, would have been one of dozens of routine drills, but under the dark shadow of Operation Ryan, became a spark that almost ignited global nuclear war. Able Archer was designed as an advanced rehearsal for NATO command structures, simulating the escalation from conventional conflict to nuclear release authorization using realistic procedures, encrypted communications, and coordinated decision-making. But in 1983, NATO planners introduced several new elements intended to make the simulation more realistic. New communication formats, high-level participation from political leaders, the inclusion of new nuclear release protocols, and even the simulation of raising DEFCON levels. To NATO, these changes were bureaucratic improvements. To the Kremlin, already on high alert due to Ryan, they looked like the very thing the KGB had been warning about: actual preparations for a decapitating nuclear first strike disguised as a military exercise. Soviet satellite analysts observed NATO aircraft dispersing to forward positions. Communications intercepts revealed unusual encrypted traffic. Intelligence from Warsaw Pact sources suggested NATO command posts were unusually active. And KGB residenturas across Europe began sending urgent, panicked reports to Moscow, claiming that NATO was moving from exercise to real readiness. In East Germany, a KGB informant inside the West German military misinterpreted a routine bunker inspection as preparation for wartime continuity operations. In London, a Soviet spy reported that U.S. embassy officials appeared tense and were holding late-night meetings, when in fact they were simply preparing cables for the following morning. But none of these explanations mattered. The KGB analysts, conditioned by months of Ryan paranoia, interpreted everything as confirmation that Able Archer was a cover for attack. Soviet military commanders placed nuclear-capable aircraft in East Germany and Poland on heightened alert. Ballistic missile submarines moved into strike positions. The strategic rocket forces quietly readied their missiles for immediate launch authorization. The sheer scale of the mobilization stunned even some within the Soviet system, but no one dared question Andropov's conviction. For 9 days, November 2nd to November 11th, 1983, the world sat on a knife's edge, unaware that the Soviet Union was preparing itself for the possibility that any moment might be the moment NATO launched for real. Ryan cables during Able Archer read like panicked diaries of men who believed they were living in the final hours before nuclear fire consumed the planet. One Residentura chief wrote, "The West is preparing a strike. We must be vigilant or we will perish." Another sent a chilling message. "We may be witnessing the implementation of the enemy's Ryan plan." Meanwhile, NATO forces had no idea they were being interpreted this way. They believed the USSR was behaving normally. Only years later would Western analysts learn how close the Soviets came to authorizing preemptive readiness. The most frightening part of this period is that no mechanism existed within the Soviet structure to challenge Ryan's assumptions. The intelligence service saw a threat because it was looking for a threat. The military saw the threat because the intelligence service told them to. And the political leadership saw the threat because both institutions agreed it existed. A self-reinforcing cycle of fear, closed, unbreakable, and utterly blind to reality, had been created. Had a single NATO aircraft crashed near the Iron Curtain, had a missile warning radar briefly malfunctioned, had any ambiguous event occurred during those tense days, the Soviet High Command might have interpreted it as the beginning of the American first strike they believed would come without warning. And because their strategy relied on launching before being destroyed, a false alarm under Ryan conditions could have triggered an irreversible chain reaction. That is the true legacy of Operation Ryan. It made nuclear war possible not because either side wanted it, but because one side believed so strongly that the other would attack that it lived in a state of existential fear waiting for confirmation. And in 1983, NATO nearly provided that confirmation without even knowing it. As Able Archer 83 unfolded like a slow-motion nightmare, the Soviet leadership continued to process every NATO move through the lens of Operation Ryan, transforming routine military activities into signs of impending annihilation. And while the West viewed the exercise as just another rehearsal in a long chain of Cold War simulations, the Kremlin, paralyzed by fear and oxygenated by months of self-reinforced paranoia, interpreted the drill as the culmination of the American plan for nuclear decapitation. A plan they believed would begin with a sudden shift from exercise to actual war, leaving the Soviet command structure blind and broken before it had time to react. Yet what made this moment uniquely catastrophic was the condition of the Soviet Union itself. For by late 1983, the country was rotting internally, its leadership sick and aging, its military overstretched, and its early warning systems decaying to the point where a single technical malfunction could be misinterpreted as a genuine signal of incoming missiles. And indeed, just weeks earlier, on September 26, 1983, the world had witnessed how fragile Soviet detection capabilities had become when Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov stared at a flashing red missile alert screen inside the Serpukhov 15 bunker and made a decision that defied not only protocol, but the entire logic of Operation Ryan. According to the Soviet computer, 5 American ICBMs were inbound. Their trajectories pointed directly toward Moscow, and the machine begged for confirmation. Yet Petrov, trusting his gut more than the system, declared it a false alarm, a decision that saved the world from a retaliatory launch. But in the Kremlin, this terrifying malfunction convinced many that the Americans were testing Soviet response times, probing their systems, perhaps preparing for the real strike. To the leadership intoxicated by Ryan's worldview, even the false alarm looked like a potential rehearsal. In that sense, Able Archer wasn't interpreted in a vacuum. It arrived as the final stroke in a sequence of events that, from the Soviet perspective, looked like unmistakable signs of U.S. preparation for war. Reagan's Evil Empire speech, the downing of Cal 007, the deployment of Pershing II missiles in West Germany aimed like daggers at the heart of the Soviet Union, and the relentless modernization of NATO nuclear forces. To Washington, these actions represented containment, deterrence, and pressure. But to Moscow, especially under the corrosive lens of Operation Ryan, they represented a tightening noose, one that could only end in a lightning strike, designed to wipe the Soviet leadership off the map before it could respond. Thus, during Able Archer, when NATO simulated the movement of nuclear warheads under realistic and encrypted communications, the Soviets believed they were witnessing the opening choreography of their own destruction. Soviet intercept operators listened in disbelief as NATO forces practiced procedures for releasing tactical nuclear weapons. Command posts shifted into simulated wartime posture. Aircraft were loaded with dummy warheads. Artillery units rehearsed nuclear fire missions. In Brussels, real NATO officials practiced escalation to DEFCON 1. None of this was unusual within the parameters of the exercise itself, but Ryan had primed the Kremlin to see danger everywhere. Andropov, now bedridden with kidney failure and ruling the USSR from hospital rooms and dim Kremlin chambers, received these developments with a mix of terror and vindication. To him, Ryan was no longer hypothetical. It was now unfolding before his eyes. The Soviet Politburo, itself made up of aging men terrified of American technological superiority, believed that Reagan had decided to end the Cold War with overwhelming force. They saw Able Archer as the moment when the United States could exploit confusion and camouflage to launch a real nuclear first strike under the cover of a drill. Soviet nuclear forces were therefore placed on an emergency form of combat readiness rarely used in peacetime. In East Germany and Poland, Soviet strike aircraft armed with nuclear bombs stood ready on runways. Crews slept beside their planes. The order was simple and terrifying. Be ready to launch instantly if confirmation came that NATO had moved beyond exercise mode. Meanwhile, missile submarines slipped beneath Arctic waters to positions optimal for retaliatory strikes. On land, the strategic rocket forces prepared their silos for a moment's notice. Some units even dispersed into forest deployment areas, the same movements they had been trained to execute only if war was imminent. Most horrifying of all, none of these measures were detected by NATO. The West remained blissfully unaware that it was playing out an exercise that the Kremlin believed was a curtain raiser for genocide. This ignorance marked one of the great structural dangers of the Cold War. Neither side fully understood how the other interpreted its actions. Operation Ryan had effectively broken the feedback loop between American actions and Soviet perception, replacing analysis with assumption and assumption with fear. As a result, the KGB field stations worked with a frantic desperation, sending wave after wave of reports to Moscow, insisting that NATO had entered the final stage before war. In Prague, a KGB officer wrote with trembling urgency that Western embassies were burning sensitive documents, a normal housekeeping procedure before winter, but interpreted under Ryan doctrine as preparation for evacuation or war. In Bonn, another agent claimed that West German intelligence officials appeared highly strained and were holding longer office hours, likely due to domestic political issues, but again perceived as Ryan indicators. In Washington, the KGB Residentura misinterpreted the movement of White House staffers as pre-strike mobilization, when in fact they were preparing for routine meetings. But these distinctions no longer mattered. Ryan had created its own gravitational field, bending reality around itself until everything confirmed the Kremlin's assumptions. Even the smallest anomalies, an unusual convoy on a NATO base, a late-night light in a government building, a civilian aircraft flying an unexpected route, were all interpreted as fragments of a mosaic pointing toward apocalypse. The Soviet intelligence community, once capable of stunning feats of espionage and analysis, had become trapped inside a hall of mirrors they themselves had built. This psychological collapse made the next phase of Able Archer even more terrifying. On November 7th, The exercise simulated the transition to wartime nuclear command procedures, including encrypted communications, the movement of command posts, and the activation of reserve command authorities. These were procedural improvements for NATO, but to the Kremlin, they were unmistakable signs that NATO was preparing to execute the actual Ryan plan, a lightning decapitation strike that would obliterate Soviet leadership in minutes. Some historians later concluded that if NATO had launched a large-scale bomber exercise during Able Archer or performed a major force mobilization drill, the Soviets might have activated pre-delegated nuclear launch authorities, meaning strike capabilities would have been placed into the hands of lower-level commanders who could have launched nuclear weapons without direct Politburo authorization. The world came closer to accidental nuclear war in November 1983 than most people will ever realize. And yet, what prevented catastrophe was not diplomacy, not intelligence sharing, not communication between the superpowers, but pure blind luck. Luck that no technical malfunction occurred. Luck that no NATO unit behaved unusually. Luck that no Soviet radar picked up a phantom signal. Luck that sheer fear did not override the last remnants of caution inside the Kremlin. Andropov, too sick and too paranoid to issue aggressive orders, remained in a state of terrified watchfulness. Some analysts believe that if Andropov had been younger, healthier, and more energetic, more capable of decisive action, the USSR might have preemptively launched a limited strike to avoid being destroyed by what it believed was an incoming NATO attack. In this fragile moment, de-escalation was purchased by human frailty. Perhaps most shocking is how completely unknown this crisis was to Western leaders. Reagan had no idea. NATO generals had no idea. Intelligence agencies had only fragments of Soviet internal thinking. To the West, 1983 was simply a tense year, not a year on the verge of global suicide. And so, Able Archer ended on November 11, 1983, with NATO declaring the simulation complete and returning to normal posture. But in the Kremlin, the mood was not relaxed. It was traumatic. Operation Ryan had brought the Soviet Union to the brink of a nuclear response. And when the Politburo realized how close they had come to unleashing Armageddon over a misunderstanding, even the most hardened officials felt a shock that rippled through the Soviet system. Andropov reportedly became even more withdrawn. Soviet generals began questioning whether the United States truly intended to attack, if the war they feared existed only in their own minds. A deep, unsettling truth had begun to dawn inside Moscow. The danger to the USSR had not been American missiles, but Soviet fear. When Operation Ryan reached its catastrophic crescendo in late 1983, the Soviet Union found itself staring into an abyss of its own creation. But what came after was in many ways even more revealing, because the near war triggered by Able Archer did not simply fade into memory. It left behind a psychological scar inside the Kremlin that forced the Soviet leadership, slowly, reluctantly, and painfully, to reassess whether its worldview had become dangerously detached from reality. And as the first classified after-action reviews circulated within the KGB and the GRU, a terrifying realization emerged. Nothing NATO had done during Able Archer resembled preparation for an actual nuclear strike, meaning the Kremlin had mobilized for Armageddon based almost entirely on its own fears rather than concrete intelligence. A revelation so disturbing that even hardline generals began to question whether the entire premise of Ryan had been built on paranoia rather than analysis. In one internal critique circulated months after the exercise, a senior GRU officer wrote bluntly that the USSR had come within a hair's breadth of misinterpreting our adversary's intentions and initiating irreversible steps, a a sanitized bureaucratic phrase that in truth meant the Soviet Union had nearly launched nuclear war by mistake. And this recognition triggered shockwaves inside the intelligence community. Even more jarring were the reports from KGB residenturas, whose frantic Ryan cables were re-examined in the cold light of hindsight, revealing a pattern of confirmation bias so severe that officers had been interpreting normal Western behaviors as signs of nuclear preparation simply because they were ordered to do so. One particularly absurd example, later acknowledged by the London Residentura, involved the misinterpretation of extra nighttime lighting in a British government office during routine budget week as evidence of war preparations, while another involved a West German official who was thought to be acting with unusual tension when in reality he had been fighting off the flu. These details, trivial at the time, now appeared horrifying when placed against the backdrop of how close the Soviets had come to launching a retaliatory strike based on such flimsy interpretations. The Soviet leadership, however, was slow to admit how dangerous the situation had been. Andropov, still alive but declining rapidly, reacted to Able Archer not with relief, but with deeper suspicion. He doubled down on surveillance and military readiness, insisting that the Americans could attempt another deception at any moment. To him, the fact that NATO had not launched a strike during the exercise did not prove the United States had peaceful intentions. It simply meant the United States was waiting for a better opportunity. Operation Ryan was therefore not dismantled, but expanded. In early 1984, new Ryan directives were issued to KGB stations around the world, demanding even more detailed monitoring of Western nuclear facilities, strategic bombers, and political leadership movements. The KGB demanded data on civilian defense drills, unexplained power outages near military installations, unusual activity at airports, and even sudden changes in the posture of Western TV news anchors. Yes, the Soviets genuinely believed Western broadcasters might alter their tone in the days before nuclear war. Under these expanded directives, the KGB ordered agents to track the personal health of Western leaders, reasoning that an unexpected hospitalization of someone like Reagan or Thatcher could be part of pre-war continuity operations. What had started as a misguided intelligence effort now drifted into realms bordering on the surreal. Yet despite this tightening spiral of paranoia, something else quietly began to unfold. Dissent. A small but growing number of Soviet officials, particularly in the analytical branches of the intelligence services, began to argue that Ryan was not gathering intelligence, but manufacturing fear. They warned that the Soviet Union was interpreting the world not as it was, but as it feared it might be, and that eventually this psychological inversion would lead to a catastrophic decision. One GRU analyst wrote privately that Ryan is a mirror in which we see our darkest expectations, not the intentions of the adversary. Another intelligence officer risked his career by submitting a report suggesting that the United States had no strategic incentive to launch a first strike, and that the entire premise of Ryan contradicted the logic of nuclear deterrence. These voices were quiet, often suppressed, and rarely circulated beyond mid-level channels, but they signaled the first cracks in the monolithic worldview that had dominated Soviet strategic thinking. Meanwhile, Ronald Reagan himself was undergoing a dramatic and unexpected shift in perspective. Reagan had been informed in vague terms by the CIA that the Soviets were anxious about American intentions, but he had no knowledge of how hysterically Moscow had misinterpreted Able Archer until 1984, when intelligence officials briefed him on the extraordinary Soviet mobilization that had taken place without NATO's knowledge. The revelation stunned him. In his diary, he wrote that he was deeply troubled by the idea that American actions, meant to deter aggression, might actually push the Soviets into a corner where they believed war was inevitable. Reagan began reassessing not only his rhetoric, but the entire trajectory of U.S.-Soviet relations. The evil empire speech suddenly felt less like firm moral leadership and more like fuel for a fire he hadn't known was spreading. This shift in Reagan would become one of the most important geopolitical consequences of Operation Ryan. But within the Soviet Union, change came slowly and reluctantly. After Andropov's death in February 1984, Konstantin Chernenko, a man even older and sicker, assumed power, bringing no new strategic insight. Under Chernenko, Ryan continued unabated. Intelligence officers still sent panicked cables. The Soviet military remained on edge. The paranoia that had nearly triggered nuclear war had simply become routine. Yet behind the scenes, the seeds of transformation planted by the able Archer scare continued to grow. And when Chernenko died barely a year later, the Soviet Union found itself at a crossroads. Into this moment stepped Mikhail Gorbachev, a man whose worldview had been shaped not by fear of the West, but by recognition of the Soviet Union's internal decay. Gorbachev's ascent in 1985 marked the first time in decades that the Kremlin was led by someone young, intellectually curious, and capable of challenging entrenched assumptions. One of the earliest briefings he received as General Secretary included a classified analysis of Operation Ryan and the Able Archer scare. Gorbachev was horrified. He realized that the Soviet Union had nearly destroyed itself because it had built an intelligence culture incapable of distinguishing reality from fear. This insight played a crucial role in shaping Gorbachev's later policies of glasnost and engagement with the West. He came to understand that nuclear war was most likely to occur not through intentional aggression, but through misunderstanding, and that the most powerful weapon against such danger was transparency. Gorbachev began quietly scaling back Ryan. Intelligence stations were instructed to reduce the frequency of panic-driven reports. Analysts were encouraged to challenge their own assumptions. Military commanders were directed to prepare new procedures aimed at preventing accidental escalation. Slowly, painfully, the ideological fever that had driven Ryan began to break. But the legacy of the operation lingered, not only within the Soviet Union, but across the entire global landscape of nuclear strategy. Operation Ryan had revealed something terrifying about the psychology of superpowers, that nations can become trapped inside their own narratives, so convinced of their enemy's intentions that they lose the ability to perceive reality, and in that blindness lies the greatest danger of all. By the time Ryan was finally wound down in the late 1980s, it had already reshaped the course of the Cold War. It had pushed Reagan toward diplomacy, nudged Gorbachev toward reform, and exposed the fragility of nuclear stability. And most importantly, it has shown that the world does not come closest to ending when leaders want war, but when they misinterpret peace. In the final years of the Cold War, as the Soviet Union lurched toward collapse and the threat of nuclear annihilation slowly receded from the immediate horizon, the true legacy of Operation Ryan began to crystallize, not in the form of classified cables or Politburo directives, but in the quiet acknowledgments of leaders, analysts, and historians who came to understand that the world had narrowly escaped destruction, not because deterrence had worked flawlessly, but because chance, misunderstanding, and frailty had collided in just the right sequence to prevent irreversible catastrophe. For when scholars later reconstructed the events surrounding Ryan, Able Archer, and the paranoia saturating the Kremlin, They realized that the operation had exposed a terrifying truth about human institutions under extreme stress. That entire governments, even superpowers with vast intelligence apparatuses, can lose the ability to distinguish between what is happening and what they fear is happening. A blindness that transforms uncertainty into perceived threat, and transforms perceived threat into mobilization for war. In private conversations during the late 1980s, Gorbachev repeatedly remarked that the world had come too close, and in 1987, he told a group of senior advisors that the Able Archer crisis proved nuclear war would not begin with an intentional decision, but with a misunderstanding layered on top of fear. Reagan, too, came to similar conclusions. After receiving a detailed briefing on the Able Archer scare, he was shaken deeply enough to write in his diary that the Soviets were not madmen. They were scared, cornered, and reacting to signals they misinterpreted through a lens of distrust. This insight influenced Reagan's approach to arms control. It contributed directly to the Reykjavik Summit, the INF Treaty, and ultimately the largest nuclear disarmament effort in human history. Ironically, the operation that nearly ended the world became one of the catalysts for reducing the weapons that could have ended it. But while Ryan's collapse paved the way for diplomacy, it left behind a more sobering lesson that policymakers still wrestle with. The realization that nuclear stability is not merely a function of missile counts, warhead yields, or launch times. It depends fundamentally on perception, psychology, and the fragile human ability to interpret ambiguous signals without assuming the worst. During the height of Ryan, the Soviet Union did not suffer from a lack of intelligence. In fact, it collected more raw data than at any point in its history. Its failure lay in the way that data was interpreted. Analysts were not free to question the premise that war was imminent. They were pressured to confirm it. And that pressure cascaded down through every level of the organization, from residenturas to Politburo offices. It is chilling to consider how many Soviets believed the United States was preparing a nuclear first strike simply because their system demanded they believe it. In the aftermath, former KGB officers reflected on the psychological cost of living inside Operation Ryan. One remarked, "We saw ghosts everywhere because we were told the ghosts were real." Another said, "Ryan made us prisoners of our own fears." And yet, inside the West, almost no one knew how deeply those fears ran. The CIA underestimated Soviet paranoia. NATO planners had no idea their exercises seemed threatening. Western leaders believed deterrence was working perfectly, and in a technical sense, it was. But that belief ignored a critical vulnerability. Deterrence assumes that both sides interpret signals rationally. Operation Ryan proved that assumption can break down. Even more unsettling is that Ryan was not dismantled because the Soviets suddenly trusted the Americans. It was dismantled because internal reformers realized the Soviet Union risked destroying itself over illusions. That means the program's end was not structural. It was circumstantial, the result of a generational leadership shift. Had different men been in power, more paranoid leaders, more hardline generals, more unquestioning analysts, the outcome could have been unimaginably different. Some historians argue that if Andropov had lived another year, the Soviets might have reacted more aggressively during future NATO drills. Others believe that a single misinterpreted radar return during Able Archer could have triggered a preemptive readiness order that escalated beyond control. In intelligence postmortems, experts still ask haunting questions. What if a NATO bomber had strayed off course? What if a U.S. submarine had malfunctioned near Soviet waters? What if a Soviet early warning satellite had reported an incoming missile cluster instead of the 5 phantom ICBMs detected on September 26. The world's survival depended on hundreds of such variables remaining stable by pure coincidence. And that dependence, fragile as a thread in a storm, is the true legacy of Operation Ryan. A reminder that the greatest danger in nuclear geopolitics is not aggression, but misunderstanding. When Ryan documents were eventually declassified in fragments during the 1990s and early 2000s, analysts were struck by how bureaucratic the apocalypse appeared on paper. The indicators were mundane. The reports were routine. The tone was dry, detached, almost procedural. And yet behind those words lay the machinery of a system preparing for the end of the world. Intelligence officers checked boxes, filled out forms, observed parking lots, monitored flight paths, and filed reports under neutral subject headings that masked the stakes of their work. It is unsettling to imagine how close humanity came to extinction because of office memos and administrative assumptions. In the decades that followed, scholars attempted to assess whether Operation Ryan had permanently reshaped nuclear policy. Some argued that the trauma of Able Archer softened Soviet posture enough to make Gorbachev's reforms politically viable. Others argued that Ryan accelerated the USSR's collapse by revealing, internally, just how dangerously dysfunctional the state had become. But most experts agree on one thing. Operation Ryan demonstrated that a nuclear superpower can become a prisoner of its own fear, and that when fear becomes doctrine, the world becomes vulnerable to catastrophe. The Cold War, in hindsight, was not simply a competition of missiles and ideology. It was a competition of narratives. The United States told itself it was defending freedom. The Soviet Union told itself it was defending survival. Operation Ryan emerged from the collision of those narratives, a secret intelligence program that embodied the darkest Soviet anxieties. And though the program is gone, the questions it raises linger. How do nations ensure their intelligence services do not become echo chambers? How do leaders avoid confusing worst-case scenarios with actual realities? How do nuclear states prevent fear from becoming prophecy? These questions remain relevant not only for historians, but for the present world, where rising tensions, emerging nuclear states, and accelerating technology create new risks for misinterpretation. Operation Ryan is not merely a historical episode. It is a warning written across the ashes of a crisis that never happened. In the end, the world did not learn about Ryan because it caused destruction, but because it did not. Because it serves as a near-apocalyptic ghost, a reminder of how easily rational systems can produce irrational outcomes, and how fragile the balance of peace truly is. When historians search for moments when humanity unknowingly stood on the edge of oblivion, they often point to the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Petrov Incident, the Norwegian rocket alarm, or the various false alerts scattered throughout the Cold War. But Operation Ryan stands apart because it was not a moment. It was a mindset, a decade-long descent into a worldview that made war seem inevitable. And when a superpower believes war is inevitable, the danger is not that it will attack first, but that it will interpret anything as the attack it already expects. As the Cold War receded into memory and the archives slowly opened, the world finally understood how close it had come during the fall of 1983, closer than any civilian ever realized at the time, and closer than most officials on either side ever admitted publicly. The story of Operation Ryan is thus not only a historical revelation, but a moral one. Peace survives not simply through strength or deterrence, but through humility, awareness, and the willingness to question one's own fears before acting on them. And in that fragile space, between fear and action, between assumption and truth. The fate of the world once hung without anyone realizing it,